Hello everyone, welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 345, and today we're going to be talking about group processes again, but specifically group decision making. So we make decisions all the time as people, and we also make decisions in groups quite frequently. However, the decisions that are made in groups tend to be riskier decisions. They tend to focus on the dominant opinion or option in the discussion. And most of the discussion that occurs during group decision making tends to focus on the dominant option or dominant opinion rather than the other options. Why is this the case? Well, in group decision making, majority rules. The majority influence is extremely powerful. People, especially if we think about the group norms that we talked about weeks ago, people like to be correct and people like to be liked by other people. So what's one way to do that? Focus on the majority opinion. If a majority of the people think this way, if you gravitate towards the opposite view, then you're probably not going to be liked by other people, and you might not be correct. There's a pretty big danger that the minority going against the majority is not going to be correct. So let's look at an example. One study examined group decision making a little bit in more detail. And basically they focused on what's known as unshared information. So they gave group members different pieces of information. They gave all the group members the same information about one job candidate and then differing types of information about job candidate number two. Job candidate number two overall had more positive qualities than job candidate one. So if we want to use that information as a guide, the group should, if they want to make the most appropriate choice, they should choose job candidate 2. But what happened during the discussion is that people focused on the information that everyone had. They focused on shared information. And that shared information gravitated primarily towards good candidate number 1. Unfortunately, because people were focusing on shared information, they did not share all of the specific information that they had, but no one else had. And so a lot of the information about job candidate 2 went unsaid, went unmentioned. And so, after all, people decided to choose job candidate number 1 because all of them agreed on the same information, even though job candidate 2 was the most appropriate candidate to choose from because they had more positive qualities. And all of this information was available to all members of the group in some way, shape, or form. So this is a little bit troubling. If we apply this to important decisions that can be made, we can think that doctors might fail to pool important information about a patient. We might think that juries might fail to discuss critical pieces of information about someone who's on trial. And this is all just simply because of social influence, because people are trying to appear likable and appear competent. And people generally tend to fall into what's known as groupthink. Groups, oftentimes, or members of the group, want to seek harmony. They want to discourage dissent. We oftentimes see group members self-censor information that they may want to say in order to keep up the cohesion of the group. And unfortunately, this can lead to increased perceptions of loyalty in terms of rational arguments or discussions. And it can lead to incorrect perceptions of unanimity, that this is a unanimous decision. It's not true because people are withholding information. So this is troubling given that we make a lot of extremely important decisions in daily life in groups, whether it be juries deciding the life and death of an individual, whether it be corporations deciding how to further their business efforts, whether it be the United States government deciding whether or not they're going to be bombed by Japan during Pearl Harbor, whether or not to invade a country, or whether or not to go ahead and launch a space shuttle, even though it may not be properly equipped to fly. All of these can have serious ramifications. And although the minority influence is often overlooked, it can be extremely powerful. One person can change an entire jury's mind. One man can change an entire country's mind about a group of people. It's difficult but not impossible for the minority to influence and convince the majority of a different viewpoint. One way to go through this is through informational social influence. If it seems like what you're saying is true, you can convince other people that, hey, you want to be correct, you want to be on the right side of history, follow my lead. having stable and reasonable views, being a vocal minority, creating uncertainty about the status quo, about the majority's position. All of these can be ways of undermining the majority influence. We also, along with making decisions, we can try and just simply coordinate with other people. When we talk about coordination, we're talking about behaving in a similar manner as others. That could be meeting up with a friend at a restaurant. That could be responding the same way as a friend on a quiz show. Sometimes it can be behaving in the opposite manner as another person. So maybe I don't want to see my enemy, so we're going to attempt to coordinate by not taking the same route, or not feeding the dog. Me and my wife, for example, not feeding the dog in the morning. We need to somehow coordinate who is going to feed the dog, and that only happens once. And most of these are examples of explicit coordination, for example, but we can see something called tacit coordination. That's when we try and coordinate with other people without directly communicating with them. So if my wife and my phones died and we couldn't communicate with each other, but we needed to meet somewhere uptown, we both like coffee, so we might both choose a coffee shop. That's an example of a focal point. Information that we might have about ourselves or the environment, situation, that we're going to use to basically be able to coordinate with each other. We can also coordinate with others in a way that's both beneficial to the people as a whole and to ourselves at the same time. And these scenarios are what are known as social dilemmas. These are situations where, again, you want to cooperate with other people, but you also want to benefit as much as possible yourself. You can think of farming lands, maybe shared farming lands that a bunch of farmers in the area might have. You want everyone to be able to use these, so everyone benefits, but at the same time, you want to benefit from those areas as much as possible. So you want to use them just enough to where you benefit, but not use them too much to where you end up losing them as a result. So there are a lot of situations like this, and these are driven by mixed motives. Again, short-term selfish motives competing against long-term group motives or long-term personal motives. So for example, recycling could be a great example of a social dilemma. It takes a lot of time and effort to separate everything into recycling, so it's not really helpful in the short term, but in the long term, it will help the planet survive, ideally, and will help you pass down your genes and make sure that your kids are living in a healthy and happy world. There are different types of social dilemmas we can focus on. Commons dilemma is when there's a shared resource that a bunch of people are using, and each person chooses how much to take, but the resource does replenish slowly. So fishing is an example of a commons dilemma. Keeping the forest alive and well, but still being able to have enough wood for what we need to use it for. It's an example of commons dilemma. Public goods dilemma is when each person chooses how much resources to give to a shared need, and then the shared need only comes to fruition if a certain amount of resources are collected. But after it's implemented, everyone benefits. So for example, PBS television station, it's funded by people, but it's free, so everyone benefits, but only if a certain number of people actually provide that information. Kickstarters are pretty popular nowadays. That's another example. So imagine Kickstarters without the kind of intermediate rewards or goals. A certain amount of people need to fund the project in order for it to go through, but after that occurs, everyone benefits. And lastly, we can have what's known as prisoner's dilemma. This is a very popular social dilemma in which two people have been caught by the police for committing a crime, and they're separated into two different rooms, interrogated separately. And each person has the option of either not saying anything or throwing the other person under the bus. So there are a couple different outcomes that can occur in this dilemma. One outcome is both people keep their mouth shut. They only get a couple of years in jail. Worst outcome is both people throw each other under the bus. Both people get a long sentence in jail. But for each individual, there is a most ideal outcome. That is, if you throw someone under the bus, but they keep their mouth shut. The other person gets thrown in jail and you get to walk free. You make a deal. But again, if you throw someone under the bus and then they also throw you under the bus, then that leads to the worst outcome. So technically, if you want to play it safe, the best outcome is to cooperate, but you could try and take the risk of ending up with no years in jail, but that could lead to a much stricter sentence. So this is often used to kind of understand how people weigh the differences between cooperation and competition, how people interact with other people in these scenarios. That's a very common task that's used. So how do we solve these dilemmas? Well, for the most part, we're not really good at them. We tend to focus too much attention on these free riders. We tend to be way too fearful of free riders. But people can perform a lot better at these tasks depending on how we frame them. So for example, if we frame these tasks in terms of pro-social motives, so maybe framing the prisoner's dilemma as a sharing task rather than a competitive task, people tend to cooperate more than they throw each other under the bus. And we can also structure the task in different ways. So for example, if we reduce the uncertainty of how other people are behaving, or how far we've come towards the goal in the case of public goods dilemmas, people are more willing to cooperate and, I don't know, help out with the final goal. Just basically educating people on these dilemmas can help people behave in more cooperative ways, and more appropriate ways. So all of you, as a result of familiarizing yourself with these dilemmas, should be better or well versed at behaving in the most appropriate ways in each of these situations. So that's all I have for time today. Thank you for your time and attention. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.